So Canan's going to start. Go ahead.
All right, yeah. I was just saying that the scope of the topic is quite big, right? The theory of state, theory of war, theory of revolution, and bringing them together in a framework capitalism consumes the world is a challenge for sure. And I thought this session could be a good continuation of the previous one that we had with Rohit's presentation, where we were discussing imperialism. But the theoretical section of that discussion was, of course, limited because our major focus was the Palestinian issue and how to understand Canadian complicity, state, and the war machine in relation to what's going on in the Middle East. So today, I will actually build upon what we discussed prior. Not everybody was there, but I'm going to, of course, reassert some of the things that we said there, and I will try to bring it to the theory of state and war, and of course, we'll connect it to the struggle. So, like, we definitely see a world where a globe still, dominated and exploited by a handful of great powers, and of course, also with the capitalist classes that are dispersed along nation states across the globe. But the question is, how are we going to understand the source and the nature of this politics, this global politics, and the concept that Marxists, have been using since the beginning of the 20th century is imperialism. Although it stopped being using a concept for some while, especially after the Second World War, when there seemed to be an expansion of capitalist economies. It is again a very, like a popular concept. Like Rohit said, anti-capitalism is in everyone's tongue. Like I think colonialism, imperialism, these are concepts that we very commonly hear in the fights that we are part of, right? Be it the Palestinian solidarity movements or the movements in relation to indigenous sovereignty or other forms of fight that we watch in the world. So when it comes to the clear understanding of this, we definitely have a narrow definition that kind of sees imperialism as a form of domination. The risk with that kind of definition is it's a transhistorical understanding, right? Because if you see imperialism like that, you're starting with Mughal Empire, like ancient China, Ottoman Empire. You can consider it like an ever-existing phenomenon. It used to exist, it exists, it will exist. So it does not give us the specifics, the analytics of how we can understand the states, the interstate rivalry or rivalry going on today. So it's too broad. And there is a narrower definition for sure, which associates it with the historical period at the end of the 19th century, where the European economy was expanding, and we have seen colonial powers were in place. Why is it narrow? Because it also kind of restricts it to a historical period, and it does not give us also the tools to understand what's going on today. So in my talk, I will try to kind of state the value of the contributions that we have from theorists like Lenin, Hilferding, Bukharin, at the time the theory was developed. And by a critique of their, of course, framework, I will, but still emphasizing their strengths, I will try to present a theoretical understanding of the contemporary inter-imperial rivalry and imperialism. One thing we very commonly encounter is seeing, imperialism as basically a north-south divide, right? It is common in academia. It's common among the activists we see, like the global north versus global south, as the latter being the sources of raw materials, other resources, and also exploitation of people, into which, like racism, colonialism, and other ideologies accompany. so this our theoretical framework actually does not depart from that dichotomy of global north and south. We see the world system more complex, and we try to understand the different levels of competition and conflict in the system in an interrelated way, which is similar to the method that Marx used when he was trying to understand the commodity, exploitation, surplus value. And we use the same method to understand the interstate system today. And for a long time, we saw, of course, dominance of like postmodernism in the movements and in academia. And along with that, I think we saw another variant, post-colonialism, which contributed a lot to certain discussions, but at the same time, the understanding or definition of imperialism that post-colonial studies also brought was not so much intimately related with the relations of production, capital accumulation, so it does not connect itself to the processes in capitalism. So our effort is also like a kind of friendly, but also underlying some of the disagreements we have. Horkheimer, when he was writing, of course, when fascism came to power in Germany, that who doesn't want to talk about capitalism should not talk about fascism at all. So the same thing actually applies to art. Who doesn't talk about capitalism cannot talk about imperialism. And why is this the case? Because definitely when we are talking about imperialism, we are talking about different planes, different levels of competition that overlap, but at the same time are not exactly the same. So we know that the system that we live in the first session, like we slightly touched upon that, is totally built upon extraction of surplus value from the working class, which means the class that does not have anything but their labor to sell to the capitalists, and the capitalists basically extracting the surplus value from that labor process. It is the source of actually profit in capitalism. And but capitalists are not friends, right? They are competing with each other. When the process of capital accumulation happens, capitalists try to invest that surplus value back in production again. They try to renovate their technological means of production, and they try to reduce the cost of labor and also the amount of labor involved in the process. That's why capital accumulation always changes the organic composition of capital, which is the fixed capital, the machines and technology, and the labor force, which is the variable capital, changes in proportion. And Marx identifies the changes in this organic composition as the reason why there is a rate, a tendency for the profit rate to fall. Why is this important? This is important because, because when we are talking about increasing militarization, interstate, rivalry or competition or geopolitical tensions, we are also talking about how economy or capital accumulation can reproduce itself, what are the barriers there, and how those conflicts can be resolved. So the competition among the capitalists and the competition among the states somewhat carried through militaristic ways. But so that's why if we are trying to understand the state, definitely we want to situate it within the capitalistic world economy, but we don't want to also reduce the state fully to the economic functions. It will be a very reductionist, instrumentalist understanding of the state, because there are also theorists like who argue that state system was not invented by capitalism, right? It's a pre-capitalist also formation. Capitalism basically inherited the state system. So as if its interstate rivalry is a pre-modern concept, it just goes on. Whereas we argue that it's not a historical contingency for us. Capitalism gave meaning to the state system because it was a necessity. It was a necessity for the organization of capital. And in different stages in world history, we have seen this relationship between the state actors, the officials, the governing officials, and the elected, governments and the capitalists, changing and formulating different expansionist policies. And these expansionist policies also changed forms. Some in the first period of basically what we call classical imperialism, from the end of 19th century until the end of Second World War, we have seen colonial domination becoming the form of expansion. And then during the second Cold War period, we saw the rivalry, but not in the form of direct colonial domination, where US hegemony replaced British hegemony slowly and integrated the rest of the world to capitalist economy in a different way, which is called kind of a non-territorial domination rather than, direct domination. It doesn't mean that they don't have military outposts and their military bases or wars as we see today, but it is different from the classical period, the British, hegemonic power back then pursued. And now Cold War is over. Since 1991, we live in a world where we see actually, rather than two powers back then USSR, a state capitalistic economy and US competing each other and organizing the rest of the world to ally with themselves, we live in a world which is more chaotic, right? US hegemony is definitely there, but it is not as assertive as it was because of the economic crisis, political crisis, difficulty of creating those seamless alliances that once possible. And we also see emergence of other powers in the world, such as China. That's why imperialism is not a static system, but it's a system where the economic power and the military power are unevenly distributed among unevenly developed economies, and we have the conflicts arising from them. So the two forms of competition, actually competition to extract more, surplus value and having more profit, and the geopolitical competition among states overlap, but they do not necessarily reflect each other in a mirroring way. Sometimes US policy to do something might not necessarily express certain factions of capital in US, or I come from Turkey, the military, aggression as a sub-imperial regional power does not always align with individual capitalists' interests. But it is argued that the state can, because it is definitely dependent on the success of its economy as well, dependent on the reproduction of the general interests of the capitalists, that it is based in territory or does operations elsewhere. Therefore, to understand the intricacies between the two is the kind of challenge that we face today as Marxists, how to theorize it better, how to understand it better. Because when the classical imperialism was in place and Lenin was trying to understand, alongside other Marxists, the nature of imperialism, the emphasis was very much on the monopolization and centralization of capital. And then that capital's dependence on credit money, basically finance capital, and merger between the finance capital and the state, creating state trust, which is a Marxist definitely understanding. But the problem is it was so much heavily reliant on the way a late industrialized country, Germany, had that pattern back then. It cannot be extrapolated to all the relations that we have between capitalists and the states elsewhere. That's why we definitely take the materialist and Marxist, kernel of that argument, but we also update it to understand how varieties can exist and how it plays in the world. By doing that, for sure, we are not on the side of the argument, you remember maybe Hart and Negri, who wrote Empire, and who basically argued that we live in a decentralized and deterritorialized, you know, like an apparatus, almost the states are obsolete now kind of argument. We definitely have the liberal argument itself, like it's represented by the Thomas Friedman, who wrote back then, like the world is flat, right? Basically, everything is going to be flattened and the state system will be obsolete. It's not the case. We definitely have seen a surge in military investments, like in 2023, like a year ago, it was like a historic rise, 9% increase, and like 2.3 trillion dollars are invested in militarization. So we are living at a time where the importance of state, its relation with the military, political, geopolitical rivalry is very prominent. And US is still the country with the highest, you know, amount of military spending. It dwarfs the rest of the world. And recently, China is catching up United States, not catching up, but still like hundreds of billions of dollars are invested in military spending, which makes it the second country with the highest military spending. And when it is combined with the Chinese economic development, you kind of see the increasing competition. And when the US hegemony is suffering a crisis, you can also see, like in Ukraine, how the, you know, like tooth and nail, actually two forces are colliding. And in Palestine, you know, how United States behind the Zionist Israeli state to maintain its regional also the control over resources and states in the region. We definitely see a heightened, you know, like a period of, again, militarization and the state becoming a very important actor that we should understand well. This happens in the background of what we have seen during COVID, like a deepening economic crisis. We see inflationary, you know, like pressures everywhere, and cost of living crisis that comes with that, and a fight back, right? The working class everywhere. In Canada, the number of strikes are historic, and not only the numbers, I think the scale, like, of mobilization is pretty wide. Like yesterday at Queen's University, we held a rally against austerity cuts, and there was this coalition of staff, you know, United Steelworkers, the staff, and QFA, the faculty, QP, the custodial staff, and TAs, RAs, TFs, RPSAC, 901. This is a historic coalition. It never happened before. So the fight is increasing against economic crisis. But this economic crisis actually is not so new. After the Second World War, the 2-decade expansion of global economy, relative, you know, like higher wages and stability that came with that, was disrupted in 1973 when we have this, you know, like oil price shock, and we started a declining rate of profit. And the global capitalistic system has not actually managed to make that trend upturn. So that's why I called like a long crisis, but a crisis, I think, which is deepening to the extent that with the 2008 financial crisis, it's not only possible to curb these prices by suppressing wages and trying to, you know, like impose this ideological hegemony of neoliberalism and forcing countries to open their borders for more open trade. It is now a harder battle for the capitalists and, of course, for the states, which are competing for more resources, for better influence, for higher profits. So we shouldn't forget that, because usually what we see is the economic crisis in capitalism has been totally solved by the neoliberal formula, and we are seeing the crisis of neoliberalism very recently, as if, you know, the system was not already itself a system of a crisis where they couldn't, even if they tried so hard, they couldn't resolve the central tensions in the global economy. I think that's an important point. So I don't have a lot of time, but I will just, outline the contours of the arguments, and I will give the word to Rohit, who will talk different aspects of also how capitalism consumes the world today. I think, first of all, we should be thinking of the current imperialist system as a system, as a complex system that has a competition between states, and this competition takes the form of economic, military, and geopolitical expressions, right? Secondly, the states in the today do not face each other as equals. We definitely have an asymmetry of power, and also it doesn't mean that those with the lesser resources of power in the history never won against the bigger powers, right? It happens sometimes, like they say, like Japan, basically victory in the early 20th century happened despite its relative weakness in military. Thirdly, we definitely see a renewed attempt to create alliances by the imperialist forces, like countries like Turkey, who's a member of NATO, still plays with, its, a relation with Russia and the US, so kind of an unstable member of the coalition. And US wants to make sure that all the countries in the region lining behind itself, if they want to benefit from the security that the US, organization or institutions provide. But it's not an easy battle. They try to encircle China, and they do the same thing in East Asia. But the three powers of imperial state, like maybe concentration or centrifugal powers, US, European Union, European economy, and East Asia today, the alliances that are forged are not happening smoothly. So we also see like hard power rather than soft power. The genocide, what we see is also an attempt to line up the Middle Eastern states, like we shouldn't forget that, and the rest of the world. And finally, of course, we see when the global system has a particular form of expansion and geopolitical conflict, we definitely see an ideological also component to that. And today we see like Zionism, white supremacy, racism. These are all part of the basically struggles which has historical roots, but which are reproduced in the contemporary geopolitical conflicts as well. So a better understanding of the state would understand the logic of the political power and the logic of the economic power as interrelated, but not necessarily reducible to each other, and would understand the contemporary world is more chaotic, where the great power rivalry is taking a form where we see emerging powers, declining powers, and aggression, that comes with the anxieties and opportunities for those great powers. I will finish here and then.
Thank you, Canan. Whenever you're ready, go ahead, Rohit.
Thank you, Canan. So in talking about how capitalism consumes the world, I want to try and take the conversation now to the present day and our historical moment. I think Canan touched upon this quite well, and I'll just add some details here and there. So what is our geopolitical reality today? And how can we best understand capitalist imperialism and how it consumes the world in this moment? As Canan mentioned, the last 2 decades have witnessed some significant developments in the global geopolitical landscape. To begin with, the system of inter-imperialist rivalries has transformed along a new fault line, perhaps for the first time since the Cold War era. This fault line today in the global landscape is undoubtedly the one between United States and China, and I want to focus a little bit on this. In the period leading up to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, China had already begun to move up the hierarchy of nations, having adopted market reforms a decade earlier than most other growing middle powers like India and so on. China's adoption of the market economy under Deng Xiaoping marks a significant shift away from the nature of Cold War competition. If Cold War was about a polarized world along largely insular economic systems, namely the liberal capitalism of the Western Bloc and the state capitalism of the Eastern Bloc, the US-China fault line was and continues to be much more interdependent, with China having deeply integrated its economy with the global market economy. Today, China is the biggest producer and exporter of manufacturing goods. It is the biggest importer of oil. And year over year, it is one of the biggest recipients of foreign direct investments in the world. It's the second largest economy and well situated within the global capitalist market and supply chains. But with such deep economic connections between China and the US, what then gives rise to such high levels of political antagonism that we can see? Firstly, the Chinese economy, despite being well integrated, continues to be significantly state-directed. Much of the production is still controlled by state-owned capitalist enterprises, and many of the large private enterprises exist with the patronage of the Communist Party of China. This kind of hybrid system comes with a contradiction. On the one hand, private capital can exert considerable economic pressure upon the party-state apparatus, and on the other hand, we have also seen under Xi Jinping that the party apparatus can virtually isolate and destroy billionaires and their enterprises and prevent their expansion both in the local and global markets. This is certainly something that makes the United States anxious because this enforced harmony of interests between the party state and the private capital makes it virtually impossible for Western capital to penetrate Chinese enterprises in the same way Chinese capital has been able to do with the Western enterprises, such as the mining companies and so on. A second reason, perhaps more important for the conflict, is China's own imperial interests. Over the last decades, Jan has mentioned this, there has been a development of the military capacity to parallel the economic capacities. Of course, while there are no maybe direct military conflict between the two powers, the economic form of competition is deeply conflictual. China does aim to take control over the Indo-Pacific region, which is currently responsible for about 40% of the global GDP. And with the largest navy in the world, this is not an unrealistic ambition, people say. Through actions like informal sanctions on South Korea and Australia, we are also seeing an increased propensity for punishing states that are allied to Washington. This shift in foreign policy also coincides with China upscaling its production towards higher-end electronics, more importantly, the emerging market of clean energy transition, which poses, again, a threat to the expansion of the industry in the US. For example, in the last year, in November of last year, China announced an export control on graphite, which is a crucial component in lithium-ion batteries, which basically sent the Western world into a frenzy, which I'm surprised because as if they've never heard of such things. China is also building a near monopoly over rare earth minerals with an effective control over 50% of most minerals from lithium to magnesium. And of course, just to add to this discussion, another example is that in the last decade, China has been Africa's largest trading partner since 2009, when it surpassed the United States. This, of course, also coincides with the independent transnational infrastructure development initiatives by China, like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is seeking to establish its own parameters of global trade, independent of the US. And even though many have called the US-China fault lines as a new Cold War, what we are seeing now is also quite different from the Cold War era. Rather than the international system experiencing a kind of polarization into two rival blocks with totally separate economies. We are witnessing a series of tensions and conflicts within global capitalism itself. This is more similar to the tensions in the lead up to the two world wars of the last century rather than the Cold War. A big problem in this kind of system is that if for whatever reason, the powers involved begin to reduce their economic dependency on each other, that has a tendency to strongly polarize the world nations as a whole. And this is something that we witnessed since the Ukraine war. In fact, the simultaneous existence of economic rivalry between US and China and the political rivalry between NATO and Russia has resulted in Beijing and Moscow coming closer together than they have been, with more and more economic and security partnerships underway. Just yesterday, the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi, hailed China's strong ties with Russia and accused the US of devising various tactics to suppress China. And he asked, and this is an important question, if it gets jittery whenever it hears the word China, where is its confidence as a major country? Referring to, of course, the US. However, it would certainly be a mistake to overestimate the extent of the decline of US imperialism. The US still has the largest military power by itself. It also leads the largest military alliance, namely the NATO, and has the single largest control of one of the more lucrative industries of the 21st century. The big tech industry is very much an American-dominated sector, with 10 out of the 20 most valuable technological companies being American. So the point is less about the actual economic or military power that US has, and more about the decline of its ability to build political consensus in the global political economy. The same United States, which under Biden cried out about the need to protect the so-called rules-based order during the Ukraine war. And every time I hear the word rules-based order, if I take a shot, I will not be alive. The same Biden has absolutely nothing to say today about the complete demolition of everything from international humanitarian law to Geneva Convention by Israel that's happening right now in occupied Palestine. As more and more global powers across the spectrum begin to move in condemnation of Israel, US continues to hang on to its justification of genocide, also because frankly it has backed itself, the Western world has backed itself into a corner after the decades and decades of disastrous foreign policy in the Middle East, where they have no moral justifications left. Just in closing I would like to say that our historical moment is at the intersection of multiple forms of crisis, what people sometimes call the polycrisis. It's political, it is economic, it is planetary. The coming together of these forms of crisis, the multiplicity of crisis, is what Alex Kalinikos called the new age of catastrophe in his book last year, taking from and building upon Eric Hobsbawm's naming of the decades between 1914 to 1945 as the age of catastrophe. So here I want to just briefly take us to the age of catastrophe in 1919, where in the Junius pamphlet, Rosa wrote about the suffering and desperation and ruins around her, because I think there is a connection to be drawn to today. She wrote, and I quote, "Business is flourishing upon the ruins. Cities are turned to rubble, whole countries into deserts, villages into cemeteries, whole populations into beggars, churches into stables. International law, treaties, alliances, the holiest of words and the highest authorities have been torn into scraps. Every sovereign, by the grace of God, is called a cretin, an unfaithful wretch by his cousin on the other side. Every diplomat calls his colleague in the enemy's country a crafty scoundrel. Each government looks upon the other as the evil genius of its people, worthy only of the contempt of the world. Hunger revolts in Venetia, in Lisbon, in Moscow, in Singapore, plague in Russia, misery and desperation everywhere. Shamed, honored, wading in blood and dripping with filth, thus stands bourgeois society. And so it is, not as we usually see it, pretty and chaste, playing the roles of peace and righteousness, of order, of philosophy, of ethics and culture. It shows itself in its true naked form, as a roaring beast, as an orgy of anarchy, as a pestilential breath, devastating culture and humanity. End quote. We know very well that these powerful words of Rosa's find resonance in our times in more ways than one. In the 21st century, since the 9/11, basically, we are also living in an era of the roaring beast, of imperialist war and destruction, from the war on terror to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Since the 2008 housing crisis, the financial system has also proven itself to be an orgy of anarchy, frighteningly unstable, with no rules or accountability measures. And with 3 regional banks in the US tanking last year, it is clear that the tremors of 2008 are still felt and will continue to be. With the ongoing climate crisis on one hand and the international public health crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, it is also clear that the system is diseased on a biological level. And we are witnessing capitalism also as the pestilential breath, as a harbinger of disease and death. This is how capitalism consumes the world. But at the same time, we are also witnessing decades of revolt and resistance that is paving the path towards hope. The year 2020, the year of the global crisis, was also the year of global revolt from Chile to Venezuela. In North America, the last year was the year of the strike. Not only is labor militancy at the picket line at the highest in recent history, we are also witnessing massive organizing wins all across the various sectors, from the tech industry to the gig economy. What we are seeing worldwide in the form of Palestinian resistance and Palestinian solidarity actions has shaken the ruling class. What these strikes, protests, revolts, resistances show is that, as I mentioned in my intervention from the floor earlier, we have hope, and that we as common people have the power to change the world. And this is not to be won by taking sides between different imperialist powers and their economic gains. And this is very important. We simply choose to focus. We don't also simply choose to focus on voting, electing the lesser evil at the ballot box or whatever. The world is to be won by struggles from below that take power from those states and build a new world based on justice and international solidarity and international peace. And it might seem like it is impossible or highly unlikely at times. But the historic Russian Revolution is a perfect example that in the most hopeless of times, the politics of hope can break through with a life of its own. Another world is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit.